In 1988, on one of the quiet streets of Philadelphia, 4-year-old Barbara Jean Horn lived with her family. The family had moved into this lovely home the previous summer. Barbara's mother and stepfather, Sharon and John Fahey, had been together for 5 years, starting their relationship when Sharon was already expecting. So, even though John wasn't Barbara's biological father, in every other way, he considered her his daughter, and she saw him as her dad. He loved the little girl very much, who was a wonderful, modest, and obedient child. To the neighbors, they also seemed like a lovely family. On July 12, 1988, the day started as usual for the family. Around 7 a.m., Sharon left for work. John, who usually worked in construction, had the day off that day, so he was spending it with his daughter. At 11 a.m., John called his wife and let her talk to their daughter. Barbara Jean asked when her mom would be coming home and if she could have a popsicle. After that, Barbara Jean sat down to watch TV while John continued cleaning the house. In the middle of the day, they went out to buy sandwiches for dinner. Upon returning, John continued cleaning, and he allowed Barbara Jean to play with her toys in the front yard. Around 3 p.m., Barbara Jean came inside and asked John if she could play with a boy who lived next door. John told her that the boy wasn't home and insisted that she play in front of the house. Since the family didn't have a fence, many neighbors saw and spoke to the little girl that day. Later, John would be criticized for allowing his daughter to play outside where anything could have happened to her. However, Barbara Jean was a very obedient child. There was a small kiddie pool by the front door, and she was splashing in the water and playing with her toys. She wasn't in the habit of wandering off or roaming the street. On the contrary, she would run back into the house every 10 minutes. Besides, John believed the neighborhood was safe for his family and child. But at 3:45 p.m., John realized that he hadn't seen his daughter for some time. He went outside and noticed her toys scattered around. John called out to her and walked around the house, but she was nowhere to be found. He walked up and down the street shouting her name. As is often the case, calm quickly turned to panic within seconds. Neighbors saw him running around frantic with fear. John went door to door, knocking and asking if anyone had seen his daughter. The neighborhood children joined him in searching for her. John then called his wife, telling her that Barbara Jean was missing and that she needed to come home. However, at that moment, he hadn't yet called the police, still hoping that his daughter would be found before his wife returned. When John eventually called the police, officers interviewed the neighbors and concluded that the last time Barbara Jean was seen was between 3:30 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. with a man. The man was estimated to be between 25 and 30 years old. He was described as white but tanned, with sandy or light brown hair. He was approximately 173 centimeters tall and weighed a little over 70 kilograms. The man was wearing distinctive clothing, a white t-shirt with some writing on it and jeans. Witnesses who saw the man with the girl said they were walking in the direction of the shopping district. Later, at least 3 people reported seeing a similarly dressed man, but this time, he wasn't with a little girl. He was carrying a large TV box. One witness mentioned that he was sitting at his desk when he looked out the window and saw the man struggling to carry the box. The man paused briefly to catch his breath, stood in front of a church for about half a minute, bent down to grab a bag sticking out of the box, and then continued walking down the street. Another person saw the man place the box right in front of their house, likely because it was trash collection day. However, the garbage had already been picked up that morning, which the homeowner informed the man. The homeowner said, "Hey, the trash was collected this morning. You can't just leave the box in front of my house. It'll sit there for a week. You need to take it somewhere else." The stranger then pulled out a cigarette, lit it, stood there for a few more minutes chatting with the witness, then picked up the box and walked away. Why does this box even matter? Because it was in this box that Barbara Jean was found. A woman living 2 blocks away from the Fahey family noticed the box sitting outside a house through her window and asked her husband to check what was inside. The poor man would never forget what he saw. Inside the box, partially covered by a trash bag and curled up in a fetal position, was the partially clothed body of a child. The girl was still wearing the same shorts she had on when she disappeared, but her top was missing. The man didn't know at that moment that it was Barbara Jean. He started shouting that there was a child's body in the box and that the police needed to be called immediately. The situation was so horrifying that it defied description. Events unfolded right before the neighbors' eyes. A child went missing in broad daylight, and within an hour, Barbara Jean was found dead in a cardboard box. People looked at each other in disbelief, wondering who could have committed such an act. Fortunately, the suspect didn't remain hidden, and the police were able to create a composite sketch of him. The medical examiner took the body and performed an autopsy. He concluded that Barbara Jean died from blunt force trauma to the head. She had been struck around 5 times with something light, as there were no fractures in her skull. It might have been a light wooden rod, much lighter than a bat. The pathologist found a bruise on Barbara Jean's shoulder. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or assault. Most likely, her body had been washed before being placed in the box, because despite the serious injuries, there was no blood on her. Additionally, there was water on the girl, and her hair was still wet. The police brought John to the station, where he identified the girl from a photograph. But they needed him for more than just that. The man was immediately accused of having done something to Barbara Jean. He, of course, denied it. John admitted that he often drank heavily and, when drunk, might have pushed his wife or raised his hand against her. However, he insisted that he never hurt his daughter. The only form of punishment John considered acceptable for Barbara Jean was push-ups because he was a former Marine. If the girl did something wrong, she had to do 5 push-ups. John sometimes joked that this made her strong and muscular, but he never laid a hand on her and adored the child. Despite the witnesses' statements, John remained the primary suspect. He was brought to the station and interrogated repeatedly, but there was nothing that directly linked him to the crime. John's build did somewhat resemble the man seen by the witnesses, but he didn't match the composite sketch at all. Although there was always the possibility that a stranger had committed the abduction, it is usually someone known to the child who is responsible. The police went door to door showing the girl's photo and the suspect's sketch. One neighbor confirmed that Barbara Jean was very shy and would not have gone anywhere with a stranger. As a result, the police increasingly leaned toward the idea that the girl had been abducted by someone she knew, likely a neighbor of the family. The police conducted a fairly extensive investigation. They checked the trash bins in the area where Barbara Jean was found, hoping to locate the missing top or other evidence. They increased the number of patrolling officers to see if anyone who returned from work around 4 p.m. might have passed by the family's home. A reward was also offered for any information leading to the perpetrator. However, despite these efforts, nothing significant was uncovered. Meanwhile, thanks to the serial number on the box, detectives identified the purchaser of the television as the Ward family, who lived nearby. The police then arrested the Ward family's son, Wesley Ward. The young man was a student, but could not prove he was at university lectures that day. He claimed he was, but this could not be verified since there was no check-in system at the university. Wesley was interrogated and his home was searched. They found a photo of the girl in the box and a stain on his room's wall. However, the detectives' initial excitement was short-lived as the stain turned out to be just paint, and the girl in the photo was a relative of Wesley. Wesley Ward did not match the composite sketch and was unlikely to be foolish enough to use his own box. It seemed more plausible that the real killer had spotted the discarded box behind the house. The police had to admit that this lead went nowhere as well. At the same time, the police continued showing the composite sketch to residents in several neighborhoods, and one man identified the person in it. He confidently stated that it was Ross Felice. Ross and his brother lived not far from the girl's home with their mother. The brothers were regular guys, played basketball with other kids, and had no prior police records. However, someone who had seen the man with the box identified Ross. Moreover, on the first evening after Barbara Jean's murder, Ross had approached her neighbors discussing the incident and asked if the police had any suspects, whether anyone had been arrested, and what was happening. But as soon as the police started circulating the composite sketch, he never appeared there again. Many officers believed that Ross was the killer. Barbara Jean's father was determined to find the guy and, by his own words, beat him to death. Detectives wanted to arrest Ross, but the prosecutor refused, stating that the jury would not convict someone based solely on a composite sketch. Ross was placed under surveillance, and the detectives kept watch on him for about 6 months. Eventually, a grand jury reviewed the cases of both Wesley Ward, whose family had bought the television, and Ross Felice. A grand jury decides whether there is enough evidence to bring a case to trial or to dismiss it. They concluded that there was insufficient evidence to charge either of the men with the murder. Because detectives had spent so much time and effort on Ross Felice, valuable time for solving the case had been lost, and it fell by the wayside and was later forgotten. In 1992, the case was handed over to detectives Martin Devlin and Paul Worrell, who were known for their impressive solve rates, largely due to their ability to obtain confessions from suspects. Martin Devlin wasted no time and accused John Fahey of Barbara Jean's murder and Sharon of being aware of it and covering for her husband. This approach to the investigation enraged the couple. The murder of their daughter was once again being actively investigated, only for them to find themselves back under suspicion. The couple sought legal counsel and, in the absence of their attorney, refused to speak with the detectives. A few months later, Martin Devlin and Paul Worrell decided to speak with 27-year-old Walter Ogrod. At one time, he and his brother lived across the street from the Fahey family. The brothers lived in the house alone and rented out the property to the Green family, whose 6-year-old son Charlie often played with Barbara Jean. For some reason, during the initial investigation, the police, knowing that the girl frequently visited that house, showed no interest in its occupants. In fact, Barbara Jean's father, John Fahey, had suggested to the police that they speak with them and even called a detective in 1991 to report that the tenants were moving out. So if there were any clues to be found, it was now. But no action was taken on John's suggestion. Suddenly, in 1992, the detectives took an interest in the house. This was partly because Barbara Jean frequently went there to play, but also because the house had attracted many undesirable characters in 1988. Walter Ogrod had a difficult childhood. Other children teased him, and he was slightly developmentally delayed, attending a school for children with learning difficulties. His mother harshly punished him for any misstep, so at the age of 11 he moved to live with his father in the same house. Walter served in the army but was discharged due to his condition. According to Walter's acquaintances, he would likely be diagnosed with autism today. He had very few friends and no girlfriend. When Walter's father died, his younger brother, who lived with their mother, moved in with him, bringing with him endless and noisy parties. This is why neighbors disliked the house, as it attracted strange people. Additionally, the house had a tragic past. In 1986, a 16-year-old girl, the daughter of a local police detective, was murdered in the house's basement, having been in the wrong place at the wrong time. 4 men who wanted to kill Walter's younger brother seriously injured him, but the girl did not survive. The men who committed the crime were convicted. There was another reason the police were interested in Walter. There were rumors that his tenant had accused him of inappropriate behavior with his 6-year-old son Charlie just 2 months after Barbara Jean's murder. This was likely a misunderstanding caused by the high level of tension and suspicion among neighbors at the time. From one perspective, it seemed like a promising lead. On the other hand, everyone who knew Walter claimed that he was always polite, never had conflicts, was non-aggressive, had no police records unlike other members of his family, and was generally described as a gentle giant who loved walking his dog. Walter did not match the description or the sketch provided by witnesses. He was much taller and larger, and no one would mistake his imposing stature. Nevertheless, the detectives decided to speak with Walter. Detectives Devlin and Worrell asked him to contact them, supposedly to clarify some details. This is a common police tactic. To avoid alarming a suspect, they pretend that the person is merely a witness. Walter did not think to bring a lawyer with him to the station, despite a friend's strong recommendation to do so. Walter brushed off the advice, believing he had nothing to hide. Initially, he thought the detectives wanted to discuss the girl who was killed in the basement of his house, not Barbara Jean. So after working an 18-hour shift as a truck driver, he went to the station, confident the conversation would last no more than 30 minutes. How wrong he was. Detective Martin Devlin started by asking if Barbara Jean had come to visit Charlie that day. Walter confirmed she had, but he told her that the boy wasn't home. However, the detective latched onto this answer and began pressing Walter, claiming that when the girl came to his house, Walter did something to her. It had been 4 years. How could he remember anything about that day? Perhaps she had come on a different day, but to the detectives, that was irrelevant. Detectives are not allowed to interrogate someone for more than 6 hours, but Walter spent 18 hours at the station after a grueling shift. That meant he hadn't slept for over 30 hours. He was denied food, water, the chance to call his lawyer, and at one point was even handcuffed to prevent him from standing up and leaving. The interrogation was not recorded at the time, and the detectives took advantage of that. They convinced Walter that they had witnesses who confirmed he had killed the girl, claiming he had simply forgotten due to memory loss. They then threatened to put him in a cell and inform his fellow inmates that he had brutally killed the girl, who would then beat him to death. When such threats come from two police detectives, it's hard not to believe them. Finally, the detective said, "If you sign all these papers, we'll let you go and talk to your lawyer." Many people don't understand what this means, especially someone with developmental issues like Walter. It's not hard to guess what happened next. He gave in and signed 16 pages of a confession to the murder of Barbara Jean. Of course, all of it was written by the detective. After leaving the interrogation room, Walter called his lawyer and asked to be picked up from the station. He only realized the gravity of his actions when his lawyer explained, "Walter, you've just confessed to murder. You're not going anywhere." On April 6, 1992, Walter Ogrod was arrested and charged with the murder and attempted sexual assault of Barbara Jean. On May 15, 1992, newspapers published details of his confession. According to the alleged confession, Walter claimed that on the day Barbara Jean came to visit Charlie, who was not home, he had an idea. He invited Barbara Jean to the basement to play doctor, which she agreed to. He then allegedly attempted to engage in sexual activity with her, and when she started to scream, he became enraged and beat her with a metal handle from a weightlifting machine that was in the basement at the time. It is worth noting that the description of the rounded metal handle did not match the murder weapon, which was described as a very light rectangular piece of wood. According to the signed confession, Walter then hid the girl's belongings in the ventilation system, though these items were never found. He allegedly washed the body, took a trash bag from the garage, and searched for something else to put the body in. Outside, he found a television box, placed Barbara Jean inside it, and exited through a back exit in the basement. After disposing of the body, he reportedly threw away the mat and cleaned the basement. The trial began in October 1993. The defense naturally focused on the argument that Walter's confession had been coerced. Walter himself took the witness stand and declared that he had not committed the crime. The jury believed him, as it was evident that the confession was not written by him or even dictated by him, as the detectives had claimed. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and voted several times before reaching a final decision. When they returned with the verdict and were about to announce it, one juror stood up and stated that he disagreed with the verdict. This caused an incredible commotion in the courtroom. The judge dismissed the jury. John Fahey, unable to contain himself, lunged at Walter, trying to strangle him. He was pulled away and handcuffed, but no charges were filed against him. At that point, no one even knew what the jury was about to decide. It turned out that Walter Ogrod was moments away from freedom. The jury was close to declaring him not guilty. They saw clear gaps in the prosecution's case that made it difficult for them to believe in Walter's guilt. The retrial began 3 years later, and this time the prosecutors addressed the gaps in their case. They still had no physical evidence against the man, but this time they called an informant to the stand. 18 months before the second trial, 2 convicted criminals, John Hall and Jay Wolchansky, claimed to the police that Walter had confessed to them. It should be noted that John Hall was a frequent informant for the police, so much so that he earned the nickname Monsignor for supposedly hearing confessions from his cellmates. Because of this, his testimony was regarded with considerable skepticism. However, Jay Wolchansky was considered credible by the police, so he was allowed to testify in court. He claimed that Walter had confessed to him about the murder. He also said that he had heard Walter confessing to his mother, but she had already died and could not refute his statements. When asked why Walter would want to kill Barbara Jean, the informant said that Walter wanted to frame the girl's father so that Walter could comfort Sharon and gradually become her lover. John and Sharon found this explanation absurd, but at that point, they had no doubt about the defendant's guilt, so they did not dispute the informant's claims. By that time, Walter had spent years in prison. He had no money and was represented by a court-appointed attorney. For some reason, the defense attorney decided that it would be better for Walter not to testify this time. This was a strange decision because, during the first trial, Walter's testimony had clearly benefited him, as the jury had seen what kind of person he was and how he spoke. This gave the prosecutor the opportunity to argue that by refusing to take the stand and personally assure the jury of his innocence, Walter had essentially admitted his guilt. This was an improper tactic, and the prosecutors knew they were not allowed to use it in court, but it was exactly what the jury heard. Overall, the attorney did a poor job defending Walter. He failed to challenge the murder weapon, did not address the lack of evidence, the discrepancies with the composite sketch, and even neglected to mention that Walter did not smoke, although witnesses said the killer of Barbara Jean did. Moreover, witnesses had seen the abductor and the girl walking down the street, whereas according to Walter's signed confession, Barbara Jean had come to his home. The attorney also forgot that Walter's mother, when she was alive, had always maintained that her son was innocent, that the detectives had lied and coerced him during the interrogation, and that this was reflected in their correspondence. Instead, the attorney tried to show why another suspect was more likely to be the culprit. This was insufficient. As a result, after 8 years, Walter was convicted of murder and attempted aggravated sexual assault. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. A man who was just one vote away from freedom was condemned to death. Years passed, and all of Walter's appeals were denied. His case attracted the attention of a prominent journalist who wrote about him and expressed doubts that an innocent person had been sentenced to death. This attention led to a new team of defenders who would assist Walter for many years. However, significant progress didn't begin until 2017, when a new district attorney allocated resources to review old controversial cases. They discovered that John Hall and Jay Wolchansky had both died in 2004. To their astonishment, before his death, John Hall decided to confess his sins. He revealed that Walter had never confessed anything to him. They hadn't even communicated in prison. Hall admitted that he had a habit of inserting himself into cases with little evidence and pretending that the inmate had confessed to him. His wife had helped with this work by buying newspapers with information about the case and conducting investigations. However, in Walter's case, she found nothing. Instead, she used her ingenuity and wrote Walter a letter posing as a stripper, asking him to confess to the murder. Walter, of course, didn't reveal anything to her either. Nevertheless, John Hall decided that the existing information was sufficient. However, Monsignor was too well known to testify again. Therefore, he persuaded Jay Wolchansky to testify in court. In exchange, both Jay Wolchansky and John Hall had their sentences reduced. Although the prosecutor lied in court, claiming that Jay Wolchansky received nothing for his testimony. Given that Jay Wolchansky's testimony was false, the only evidence against Walter remained his confession. However, more and more evidence of his innocence began to emerge. In 2004, a man who had been in Walter's basement after Barbara Jean's murder testified that there was no trace of cleaning, blood, or any indication that a murder had occurred. Furthermore, according to Walter's signed confession, he had removed the victim through the basement's back door. But although such a door did exist, it had been completely barricaded several years before, making it impossible for him to have passed through it. In 2008, Walter's new defense team demanded that all collected evidence be compared with Walter's samples. In 1988, the police were not as advanced in DNA testing as they were in 2008. However, the police still had samples from under Barbara Jean's nails, DNA from her body, and even fingerprints on the box. The prosecutor responded that many pieces of evidence had been lost or discarded as unnecessary. DNA might be irrelevant due to the state of forensic laboratories at the time. The DNA was found not directly on the victim's body, but during the autopsy when her body was being washed. It was possible that the DNA was on the autopsy table, not on the victim. This DNA belonged to an unknown man, not Walter. However, the defense could not use this information. The fingerprints on the box were compromised because police officers had handled it with their bare hands. The defense also discovered that the prosecution had not provided the defense attorney with most of the case materials. Additionally, they found that Barbara Jean had actually died from strangulation, not from head trauma as indicated in Walter's confession. It was likely she died because the perpetrator covered her mouth with his hand. The bruise on her shoulder turned out to be a hickey. Furthermore, according to the confession, Barbara Jean had come to Walter's home, but all witnesses had seen her walking down the street with a man. Collectively, this information led to a petition to overturn Walter's conviction. The new district attorney was prepared to declare him innocent, but the decision required a judge's ruling. Then COVID-19 struck. All hearings were postponed, and Walter's case was among them. For some reason, the release of an innocent person sentenced to death was not a priority. Walter fell ill and was isolated in his cell, forced to battle severe symptoms alone. He recalls that every breath was laborious, as if he was breathing through a wet sponge. By some miracle, he survived. Walter Ogrod was finally exonerated and released in 2020. An innocent man had spent 28 years, 1 month, and 29 days in prison, including 23 years and 7 months awaiting execution. His health had deteriorated, he walked with a severe limp, and he was unable to work. Naturally, he filed a lawsuit. Walter agreed to a settlement and received $9.1 million. $9 million for nearly 30 years of life and ruined health. As for another victim in this case, little Barbara Jean, her murder remains unsolved, despite the case being officially reopened. Walter's defenders, having conducted their own investigation, point to at least 2 other suspects. For instance, around the same time that Barbara Jean was murdered, 10-year-old Heather Coffin was raped and killed about 1.5 miles from Barbara Jean's home. The suspect was 22-year-old Raymond Sheehan. A witness in Barbara Jean's case had picked him out from a lineup as someone who likely carried a TV box. However, there was no evidence linking him to either case. Only 15 years later, in 2003, when Walter's death sentence was confirmed, DNA from Heather's body linked Raymond to her murder. He was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment. Given the striking similarities between the cases and their close proximity, it would have been logical to compare his DNA with the sample found on Barbara Jean. But this was never done. As one of the other potential suspects has already died, it will become increasingly difficult with each passing year to bring the true killer to justice if they are ever identified. It's possible that Barbara Jean's murder never had a chance of being solved. There are cases where, despite sincere efforts by the police, the killer remains at large. But once Detectives Devlin and Worrell took over the investigation, they destroyed and nullified all the work done by their colleagues, turning the investigation into a farce. The detectives had a theory about what happened even before speaking with Walter. They used this information to feed him a story and walked out of the interrogation room with a dramatic effect. Of course, Walter's case was not the only one in which the detectives had a hand. Martin Devlin was also accused of obtaining a false confession against Anthony Wright in 1991, who allegedly raped and murdered a 77-year-old woman. Anthony Wright was exonerated in 2016. Another person, Willie Vesey, who spent 27 years in prison due to the same detectives, was convicted in 1993 and automatically sentenced to life for second-degree murder. Willie was released in 2019. Thanks to a new district attorney who took on the task of reviewing old cases, several prisoners, including Walter Ogrod, walked out of the courtroom as innocent as they had entered it. June 2011. The first days of summer brought bright sunshine to the town of Pau in the Atlantic Pyrenees, a department in the southwest of France. Like many children of divorced parents, 14-year-old Alexandre Juncas lived with his mother from Monday to Friday and spent the weekends with his father. Saturday, June 4th, 2011, was just such a weekend. The beginning of this story will seem familiar to all parents of a teenage child. The time had come when the son asked to be allowed to go to his very first party. His heart said no, but Alexandre's father, Philippe, knew that he couldn't lock the boy up in 4 walls and forbid him from socializing with his friends. Alexandre and Philippe had a trusting relationship, and the father allowed his son to go, but insisted he return by 8 p.m. Of course, that was too early, and after a brief negotiation, father and son agreed that the teenager would be home by 10 p.m., not a minute later. Philippe comforted himself with the thought that his son was already 14 years old, knew how to behave around strangers, and had promised to come back on time. Besides, both summer and youth would pass by quickly, and the boy should have time to enjoy both. So Alexandre got on his bike and went to meet his friends. He was gone for almost half the day. At 9:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before he was supposed to be home, he sent his father a message. The teenager wrote that he would be late but promised to arrive by 11 p.m., no later. However, at 11 o'clock, Alexandre didn't show up, nor did he send another message. His father tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Philippe told himself that his son had probably run out of battery on his phone, stayed overnight at a friend's house, and would return in the morning. However, the next morning, Alexandra didn't come home. His father panicked. He called his daughter, Alexandra's older sister. She was 17, close to her brother, and would know where he was. At the very least, she might know who he spent the evening with, but the girl knew nothing. Philippe rushed out to search for his son on the streets of the city. Midday was approaching. By 7 p.m., Alexandra's mother, Philippe's ex-wife, Valérie Lance, was supposed to pick him up. Philippe called her to let her know they had a problem. Their son was missing. Valérie decided they needed to contact the police. At 8 p.m., she went to the station to report her son missing. In her mind, she was replaying all the horrible things that could have happened to her child. However, the police didn't share her concern. They offered a completely different explanation. They bluntly told the worried mother that teenagers often run away from home, especially children of divorced parents. Valérie assured them that she and her ex-husband had tried to make the separation as painless as possible for the kids, and besides, it had happened 10 years ago. The officers then asked if Alexandra had any problems at school, but this theory was also disproven. Alexandra was fairly popular, well-liked by both teachers and classmates. Meanwhile, Philippe was still driving through every street in the city. Just 50 meters from his house, he spotted Alexandra's bike, locked to a post. The bike was in working condition, so why had he stopped so close to his father's house? Philippe immediately informed the boy's mother. The next day, given that the police had not taken any action to search for the teenager, the parents themselves found the kids with whom their son had spent the day. In the afternoon, the teenagers were skating at the skate park, and then at 5:30 p.m., they went to a party in the suburbs of Zaragoza. They stayed there until around 7 p.m., after which they all went to a friend's house to continue hanging out. At 10:45 p.m., Alexander said that it was time for him to go home, said goodbye to everyone, and left. It was only about 1.5 kilometers from there to his father's house. Something must have happened during this short ride. Frustrated by the lack of response from the police, Valérie and Philippe turned to the local press. The next day, newspapers published the missing teenager's photograph. Naturally, the police had no choice but to start working. Over the next 2 weeks, the officers searched every house and building between the location where the teenagers had been hanging out and Philippe's house. This led to nothing. No one had seen Alexandra. However, between these 2 points on the map was a post office building with a working surveillance camera. Alexander appeared on video at 10:51 p.m. He was riding his bike along the side of the road. No one was following him, and he wasn't running away from anyone. Alexander was just 500 meters from his father's house. Everything indicated that he should have made it home on time. 3 weeks after Alexandra's disappearance, 2 homeless people who had settled by the banks of the Gave de Pau River noticed something in the water. The discovery resembled part of a human leg. The media reported the gruesome find, but stated that the body part belonged to an adult male. However, a DNA test confirmed that it was the leg of 14-year-old Alexander. It had been severed after his death. Experts were adamant about this conclusion. When the boy's parents were informed of the discovery, Valérie began to scream uncontrollably. She kept repeating, "It's not him! Not him!" No one argued with her. They simply offered to conduct a second test. The mother eventually had to accept the horrific truth. The fact that her 14-year-old son had been killed was already awful, but the idea that his body had been dismembered afterward was unbearable. The teenager's leg was found in the Gave de Pau River, which flows through the city of Pau. As a result, the police began their investigation. They scoured the river upstream and downstream, climbed the roofs of nearby buildings, and examined the sewer system. But nothing more was found. However, they recalled the extensive work that had been done on the river near the place where part of the teenager's body was found. A temporary dam had been constructed there, essentially a mound of earth and gravel. What if the remains were buried underneath it? Of course, they needed permission to excavate the recently built dam. It took some time, but the authorization was granted. Excavators began their work, digging for days. Alexandra's mother, Valérie, was always present during the search. She feared what they might find, but believed she had to be there for her son. She noticed that the police had brought in a search dog specialized in locating bodies. The dog pointed to several spots, after which the police set up tarps to shield the excavation site. Unable to bear the suspense, Valérie asked the officers if they had found anything, and she read the answer in their eyes. Everyone avoided her gaze until one of them nodded, confirming what she already feared. They had found almost all of Alexandra's body parts. The remains were taken by a forensic pathologist who determined the cause of Alexandra's death. The teenager had been struck multiple times in the face with a hammer. However, the pathologist was interested in more than just the cause of death. It was crucial to determine whether the killer had any knowledge of anatomy and what tool was used for dismemberment. First of all, the forensic expert confirmed his initial conclusion that Alexandra was dismembered post-mortem. But he also discovered something else interesting. The body was initially dismembered by someone who clearly had no experience with such actions. This person then turned to someone more skilled in this area, likely a hunter or butcher, someone accustomed to cutting up carcasses. Thus, it became clear that the 14-year-old boy had been killed by blows to the face with a hammer, after which his body was cut into pieces and buried. But the questions remained. Who did this, and where was the crime scene? The police had one clue: the bicycle, which had been locked to a post just 50 meters from his father's house. Why Alexander had locked his functioning bicycle remains unknown. However, it suggested that the attack likely occurred very close to his father's home, possibly on the street nearby. The police continued to work hard on this case, although at first they did not take Alexander's disappearance seriously. As soon as they took up the case, they worked tirelessly. However, they made no progress in the investigation. Finally, in July 2012, Alexander's body was handed over to his parents and they were allowed to bury him. They received 2 bags. One contained bones and the other organs. It is difficult to convey the pain of the parents who had to bury 2 bags, everything that remained of their loving, cheerful, and joyful boy. The funeral took place. Maria provided several condolence books in which everyone could write something. Then they were handed to the parents so they could read some pleasant things about their son, how other people remembered Alexander. Valerie reread these entries. One of them intrigued and troubled her. Someone had written, "I know what happened to you. I'm sorry for your parents. The jerk who did this is underground." And the signature, Homeless Mike. Valerie handed the condolence book to the police. The police took this lead seriously. First, because there were indeed many homeless people living in the city, and these individuals often notice a lot while remaining unnoticed themselves. Second, they suspected who it was about. Mike is indeed homeless. He is a physically very exhausted man. He always looks a little lost, follows bad company, and can even show aggression. During the interrogation, Mike stated that he did not remember the evening of June 4th, 2011. He knows nothing and did not write the message addressed to the deceased boy. Furthermore, the man cannot read or write. Realizing that the trail of Mike was leading to a dead end, the police continued to dig deeper. They were interested in all homeless individuals who could be called Mike, as well as Michael or Michelle. They discovered that in the vicinity of homeless Mike, there is a second Mike, although in reality the young man's name is Michael. 25-year-old Michael Barrell had a troubled childhood. He left home early, committed petty crimes, and wandered around the country. But since 2009, he had been living in Poe with his girlfriend, 45-year-old Fatima Enadia. Fatima was 20 years older than her boyfriend. She used illegal substances and had mental health issues. The investigators naturally wanted to bring Michael in for questioning. However, he was already in prison. Michael had been incarcerated for more than a year for assaulting another homeless man with a hammer. It turned out that Michael always had a hammer with him. Moreover, the assault occurred just a week after Alexander's murder. The hammer was, of course, seized as evidence. The police requested this evidence to test for Alexander's DNA. Unfortunately, they found no DNA. But the police also examined the young man's phone data on the night of the murder. On the evening of Alexander's disappearance, his phone was in the same area where the boy was last seen, and 12 days later at 5 a.m., Michael's phone appeared at the dam where the body was found. Furthermore, on the night of the murder, he made many calls. He called his girlfriend Fatima and persistently tried to reach someone named Claude. He called him 9 times. Claude is a 72-year-old retiree living in a village 40 kilometers from Poe. He has his own farm. Claude did not answer Michael's calls all night and half of the next day. When Michael finally managed to get in touch with the man, he arrived at Fatima's house just an hour later. What could connect people like Fatima, Mike, and Michael with a respected elderly farmer from the suburbs? The investigators still had to find that out, although they already had their suspicions. After all, Claude was a hunter. Just under 2 years after Alexander's murder, the judge authorized the arrest of Mike, Fatima, Claude, and Michael, who was already in prison. Each of them was interrogated separately. The conversation with Michael progressed unexpectedly quickly. He recounted that June day had gone horribly wrong. He had a fight with Fatima because he suspected she was cheating on him. After the argument, he went out to take a walk with his friend Homeless Mike to blow off some steam. On the street, he encountered a teenager on a bicycle. The teenager said nothing to him and did nothing, but Michael was under the influence of alcohol and drugs, was very angry, and wanted to let off steam. As he passed by the boy, Michael pushed him and then grabbed his hammer. He smashed the head of the completely unfamiliar teenager to calm down because he was angry at his girlfriend. He had no other explanation. Then he moved the body of his victim to a basement, although he claimed he could not remember which one. The investigators were convinced that it was the basement of Fatima's house. Michael described how he tried to reach Claude to help him get rid of the body. Claude only showed up the next day. The man put the teenager in the trunk of his car, took him home, did what he needed to do there, and a few days later brought back parts of the body. Almost 2 weeks after the murder, Michael and Claude buried the parts of the body together under the dam. Next, the investigators interrogated Claude. The man denied everything. The investigators asked him why Michael had called him 9 times immediately after the murder if he wasn't asking for help. And why did Claude show up the next day after listening to his messages? But the elderly man insisted that he was not involved in the crime. He went to meet Michael because they had a relationship. Claude sometimes paid Michael for intimacy. That is, that Sunday, he went to him not because of the corpse, but to satisfy his own intimate needs. The officers searched Claude's car, a Peugeot 605. They wanted to check the vehicle for Alexander's DNA, but unexpectedly, they found out that this was not the right car. The man had bought an identical vehicle, only a different color. He had repainted it and switched the license plate so that it would be impossible to distinguish it from his old car. Claude had sent his previous car to the junkyard, where it had already been sent for recycling. It was sent to the melting shop. Thus, he changed cars without changing them. This is a well-known trick in the criminal world, and the police asked a perfectly logical question. Why would a peaceful retiree go to such lengths with a car? Moreover, Claude's phone data confirmed that, like Michael, he was at the dam 12 days after the teenager's disappearance, when the men presumably buried parts of the body. While the 4 defendants were in custody, the police continued to gather evidence against them. Suddenly, they discovered that homeless Mike could not be connected to Alexander's murder. On June 4, 2011, he was 200 kilometers away from the city of Pau. This means that Michael lied when he claimed he was walking with him that evening. The investigating judge interrogated him again, and Michael Barrel stated that he was indeed not alone that evening, but not with Mike. This is when the 4th character enters the scene, 22-year-old Christophe Camille, another young man with a complicated fate. Since childhood, his father had abused him, and his mother completely ignored him. He ended up in a mental health clinic and was supposed to stay there on the night of the murder. However, that day was his birthday. The doctors let him go to celebrate his birthday with friends. The young man wanted to smoke but didn't have any cigarettes. He hoped that the tobacco shop, which was open until 11 p.m., would be open, but he didn't know what time it was. A teenager rode by on a bicycle. Christophe didn't know his name, but it was Alexander. Christophe asked Alexander what time it was. The boy stopped and took out his mobile phone to check the time. Upon seeing the phone, Christophe grabbed it and ran, colliding with Michael. Michael wanted to take the phone from Christophe. At that moment, Alexander had locked his bike to a post and approached to demand his phone back. Michael didn't like this. He was in a state where a light spark was enough to ignite him. He pushed Alexander, took out a hammer, and began to hit the boy in the face again and again, while Christophe was running away from the crime scene. The missing link was this, Christophe. It was because of him that the boy didn't make it home just 50 meters away. In 2 minutes, a completely senseless crime occurred. Alexander was killed over a mobile phone that his mother had bought for him for €9. After Michael's confession, homeless Mike was released. The others were charged. Christophe confirmed that he was there but did not kill Alexander. Fatima and Claude did not confess to anything. Claude swore that he did nothing with the boy's body, while the woman claimed she knew nothing despite the bloodstains found in her basement. Interestingly, Fatima called the police on June 17th and June 26th regarding her boyfriend. However, the operator simply didn't believe her because, being mentally ill, she constantly called the police with various messages. At the very beginning of the trial, the judges made an unexpected decision. Until then, all 4 had been arrested in connection with the murder, but the judges decided that their actions fell not under murder, but rather under robbery with aggravating circumstances, robbery involving violence, leading to death. In other words, in the judge's opinion, there was no intention to kill the boy, and Alexander's parents had to come to terms with this. The trial began in June 2016, 5 years after Alexander's death. At the end of the proceedings, the mother of the murdered boy was allowed to address Michael personally, and she demanded that he tell the truth about what happened that night and hide nothing. No one expected that his account would have the effect of a bombshell. Michael stood up and, to the horror of everyone present, confessed that Alexander was alive when he brought him into Fatima's house. The boy opened his eyes, cried, and even began to scream. Fatima gave him medication, and Michael became enraged again, instinctively grabbing the hammer once more. It was then that he killed the teenager. Michael ended his story by asserting that this was the true truth, and perhaps it was, but it was simply unbearable for the parents, for the boy's friends, for the townspeople, and for everyone who heard this story. The parents found solace in the fact that their son died very quickly, but he was alive for some time, and the criminals could have let him go, but chose to kill him instead. Michael was sentenced to life imprisonment. Christoph was sentenced to 15 years. Fatima received only 3 years for failing to report the crime. Claude received 3 years for destroying evidence and what he did with the body. He committed a crime posthumously, which is punishable by the maximum sentence of 3 years. Claude was the only one who tried to appeal, but his sentence remained in effect. We often hear that crimes committed by strangers, especially when the victim is a child, are rare. Moreover, the hammer as a murder weapon also typically indicates the personal hatred of the murderer towards the victim. That is why it is so hard to believe that such a thing could really happen. One person stole the boy's phone, which his mother bought for him for €9. Another killed a completely unknown 14-year-old boy with a hammer who had done nothing to him. The woman in whose basement the victim was finished off did not report it to the police, and the respected pensioner, a farmer, an elderly man, dismembered the boy's body and helped bury it under the dam, and no one thought to stop and consider what they were doing until it was too late.
This is one of the most famous cases in Europe in the 20th century. The case of Caroline Dickinson, a 13-year-old girl found dead in a room of a youth hostel in France, where 4 other teenagers were also sleeping. The investigation that led to the arrest of her killer, an international serial rapist, is truly remarkable because it demonstrated the persistence of the French police, the effectiveness of international cooperation, and also marked the beginning of extensive DNA testing in criminal investigations. Late in the morning of July 18, 1996, John Dickinson was at his workplace in Cornwall, in the southwest of England, when his boss approached him. The boss asked John to step into his office, saying there was something he needed to tell him. Inside the office, police officers were already waiting, an introduction that almost never brings good news. The officers informed John that they had come regarding Caroline. His 13-year-old daughter was dead, and she had died under mysterious circumstances. Caroline Dickinson was an ordinary girl who loved being at home. She took ballet lessons, played the clarinet, and was a member of the school orchestra. Her parents, Mother Sue, who worked as a nurse, and Father John, an environmental specialist employed by the local council, were divorced. However, Caroline had a good relationship with both of them and spent a lot of time with them and her younger sister Jenny. That summer, Caroline was on a trip to France with a group of other teenagers from Britain. She was learning French, and visiting France had been a dream of hers. She had saved up most of the money needed for the trip herself and asked her father to cover the rest. Although Sue was not very keen on letting her go, John agreed to pay for the trip. Caroline was having a wonderful time in France, as she wrote in the postcard she sent to her family. July 17th was the last day of the trip, and on July 18th, the group was scheduled to head back home. On their last day in France, the teenagers visited the famous local attraction, Mont Saint-Michel-Abbé, and afterward, they were accommodated in a youth hostel in Plaine-Fougère, Brittany. Besides Caroline, there were 4 other teenagers sleeping in room number 4. By breakfast time, everyone had woken up, except Caroline. Her friends thought she was pretending and tried to shake her awake, but then noticed that her skin was cold and her lips had turned blue. They called for a nurse who quickly realized that nothing could be done to help Caroline. Between her legs, she saw a bloodstain. Naturally, the police were immediately called to the crime scene. Caroline's parents, John and Sue, were devastated. It was the first time their daughter had gone on a trip without them, as if she were an adult. Her vacation was nearing its end, and she was supposed to return home any day. But now she was dead. The girl's parents immediately traveled to Brittany. Meanwhile, a forensic pathologist was working at the crime scene. Caroline had likely died from suffocation, but the autopsy report was needed for a definitive determination. Since the girl's pajama bottoms were lowered and there was blood in the genital area and on the mattress, he suspected that she had been assaulted. There was also a semen stain found nearby. Today, this would be a significant breakthrough for the investigation, but in 1996, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. There were no databases of criminals, especially those who had committed sexual offenses. Nonetheless, the perpetrator's DNA could help convict the killer if a suspect was found. Apart from this, there were no other clues. The girl's mattress had not been moved, but under the sheets lay a piece of cotton wool measuring 9 centimeters by 12 centimeters. Investigators speculated that it might have fallen from one of the girl's bags. A group of 40 teenagers had come from Britain on this trip. They were questioned one by one, starting with the boys. Then the teachers, drivers, and anyone who could have approached the girls' room were interviewed, including 6 tourists who had stayed at the hostel the previous night. Particular attention was paid to the 4 teenagers who were in room number 4 with Caroline. There were 2 bunk beds in the room, but there were 5 teenagers, so Caroline slept on a mattress on the floor, laid between the 2 beds. The teenagers explained that Caroline had asked for this arrangement because they were friends and she wanted to spend the night together with everyone. One of the girls said the last thing she remembered was them all gazing at the beauty of the night sky, while Caroline sang a lullaby called Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. After that, they all fell asleep. But how was it possible that none of them heard anything? The room was very small. In fact, 2 of them did hear something during the night. One girl said she heard Caroline kicking the mattress. Then she heard moans, a raspy cough, and thought she heard Caroline say, "Mom, Mom, help!" The girl assumed her friend was having a nightmare. Another student saw a shadow in the doorway, but assumed it was one of the other girls going to the bathroom. It never occurred to them that something serious was happening, so they fell back asleep. However, it wasn't just the British students staying at the hostel. There were other guests as well, including 2 pairs of bikers. One couple reported that someone peeked into their room at night, as if they had mistaken the door. But the biker's wife stayed awake and heard the man walking down the corridor, opening other doors. Generally, there was a lot of movement in the hostel, even in the evening, as people went to take showers and then dispersed to their rooms. Naturally, this raises the question, why wasn't the girls' room locked? It was strictly forbidden to lock the doors for safety reasons, such as in case of a fire. However, in such a crowded place, someone surely must have seen something. Around midnight, 3 girls who went to the bathroom together saw a man with unkempt hair. Apparently, the same man was seen on the 2nd floor by teacher Nicholas Ward at 12:15 a.m. Very interesting testimony came from a witness in room 5 named Amy. The girl explained that her eye was itching badly because the boys had smeared shaving cream on her face, so she wanted to go to the bathroom to wash up. But when she was in the corridor, she thought she saw the head mistress, so she quietly returned to the door and froze in fear upon seeing a large unknown man. His hand was on the doorknob of the neighboring room. The girl was so scared that she silently closed the door and waited for 15 minutes before heading to the bathroom. When she finally went out, she saw the same man again, but this time he was going down the stairs. He noticed her, made a grimace, and said something, though she didn't understand what. It might have been in Spanish, but Amy wasn't sure. One of the teachers, named Jackie, also saw a large man with disheveled hair. Around 5 in the morning, she heard footsteps and thought it was one of the kids trying to sneak out. So she looked out the window into the courtyard. She saw a man wearing a jacket and jeans, who turned left and disappeared from sight. Shortly afterwards, she heard the sound of a car starting. Judging by the noise, it was an old vehicle. Thus, the suspicious stranger was seen by many, and people even noticed him, but they couldn't call the police just because the man looked suspicious. The autopsy results arrived, confirming that Caroline had been strangled. The cotton pad found under the sheets had traces of her saliva and blood, indicating that the killer had used it to suffocate her. The girl had also been sexually assaulted. The forensic expert concluded that the assailant acted with a finger or some object while simultaneously satisfying himself, which explains why semen was found on the mattress and her pajama pants. Additionally, the expert noted that Caroline's bladder was empty. Since it takes the body 15 to 45 minutes to start refilling the bladder after urination, he concluded that she had visited the bathroom shortly before her death. The police investigation, led by an examining magistrate, initially kept all details of the case secret. Suddenly, a press conference was held to announce a major breakthrough. 2 days after Caroline's murder, the police had arrested a suspect named Patrice Paid, a 39-year-old vagrant. who was known for alcohol and drug abuse. Most importantly, he had a prior conviction for a sexual offense and matched the description provided by witnesses. When shown his photo, several witnesses identified Patrice as the large man seen at the hostel. Upon his arrest, Patrice initially denied any involvement. However, after 43 hours, he confessed to the assault and murder of Caroline. Though his statements contained significant inaccuracies, such as describing Caroline as a blonde and incorrectly recalling the sleeping arrangements of her roommates. Nevertheless, the confession was considered a significant victory, and the case seemed to be closed just 4 days after the crime. As a precaution, a DNA sample was taken from Patrice and sent to the laboratory. Once in custody, he immediately began writing letters to the judge, insisting that his confession had been coerced and that he was innocent. He claimed that he had been deprived of his medications and alcohol, which was critical for him as an alcoholic. The judge ignored his letters. For over a week, the media celebrated the success of the case, but then the DNA test results arrived. While DNA can confirm guilt, it can also exonerate the innocent. It turned out that Patrice's DNA did not match the semen found on Caroline's pajamas. Multiple tests were conducted, and the results remained consistent. Patrice was not the killer. This development became a notorious example cited by defense lawyers to criticize the police's reliance on confessions, which do not constitute absolute proof. The judge, however, was reluctant to relinquish his perceived success. Although he had to release Patrice, he placed him under surveillance, suspecting him of being an accomplice to the actual perpetrator. Yet the notion that two men could enter the small room without being heard or noticed by any of the teenagers seemed far-fetched. The setback was a significant blow to both the investigators and Caroline's parents. At least Patrice was compensated for the 17 days he spent in prison, receiving 10,000 euros in 1998. The investigation returned to square one, but the police were unable to make any significant progress. Meanwhile, on July 25th, Caroline was buried, and on the day of her funeral, her parents received a postcard from her, which she had sent from France. For John and Sue, this was simply unbearable. John was especially distressed by the lack of results and the investigating judge's refusal to share any information with them. After 8 months, John decided to return to Brittany to push the investigation forward. He requested that the investigating judge compare the DNA of all the men in the village of Plenfuger with that of the killer, every last one of them. The judge was shocked by this request, considering it a crazy endeavor that would cost a fortune. He wanted nothing to do with it and demanded that John's lawyer, Dickinson, explain how investigations were conducted in France rather than trying to pressure him into it. This sparked a confrontation between the judge and the father. After another 3 months, John Dickinson secured support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He wrote to President Chirac asking for the investigating judge to be replaced, accusing him of inaction. No one had questioned the residents living near the hostel. Crucial witness testimonies had been ignored, and no fingerprints had been collected. And now the judge was also unwilling to respond to the father's request for a thorough examination of the men in the village. John's determination was palpable. The investigation was handed over to a new judge, Renaud van Rooyenbeke, who was open to such extensive measures. He agreed with John's belief that the killer lived in the village of Plenfuger, or a neighboring village. He was even afraid to consider that the perpetrator might have come from another region, let alone another country, as finding him would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, virtually impossible. Thus, it was decided to check all men in the region aged 15 to 35. This was the first such extensive DNA testing in France. Many local men were willing to participate, although they were concerned that the results could be erroneous. Ultimately, 400 men from the village were tested, followed by 3,500 men from the surrounding region. However, all the tests came back negative. Furthermore, the new judge Van Rooyenbeke decided to take an action that his predecessor had completely ignored. He published a composite sketch of the suspect in the press. A few months after the murder, a teacher accompanying a group of children staying in Plenfuger confided in the college director where he taught, admitting that he had encountered someone in the hostel corridor that fateful night, but had not told anyone. Investigators returned to England to interrogate him, and he broke down in tears. He couldn't forgive himself for not coming forward earlier, and found it difficult to look the other students in the eye. It turned out that he had some drawing skills. He created a composite sketch of the suspicious stranger. The sketch depicted a man of European descent, athletic build with broad shoulders, tousled hair, thick eyebrows, and pronounced facial features, around 30 years old. The composite was published in newspapers across France and Britain. The Sun newspaper even offered a reward for information about the man. This led to fantastic results. generating over 3,000 leads that needed to be investigated one by one. However, the police discovered that around the same time Caroline was killed, similar attacks had occurred in the region. For example, in Saint-Lunaire, 50 kilometers from Plenfouger, an incident took place on the same day as Caroline's death. 4 young English girls were staying in a hostel room there. One of them, Kate, recounted waking up to a man approaching her, placing his hand over her mouth, and preparing to remove her underwear when her roommates woke up. The girls turned on the light and saw a large man with disheveled hair. They asked him what he was doing in their room, to which the stranger calmly left without slamming the door. The girls reported the nighttime incident to their teachers and chaperones, but since they were scheduled to board a ferry the following day, they decided not to contact the police. It wasn't until articles about Caroline's case appeared in the British press that Kate revealed to her parents that something similar had happened to her. What was particularly interesting was that laboratory analysis confirmed Caroline had been strangled with a type of cotton wool that had been brought from Britain, but no such cotton was found in Plenfouger. It turned out that Kate's mother had given her that cotton wool. This indicated that the killer had taken the cotton from the site of his unsuccessful attack and used it to strangle Caroline. This established a connection between the two attacks. He had failed in one hostel and decided to complete his crime in another. But that was not all. Similar attacks occurred over the summer in other neighboring villages. The victims were often young English girls. Judge Renaud van Rooimbeke then decided to work with a profiler, a relatively new approach in France. This collaboration allowed him to gain a better understanding of the killer and assailant as someone who moves freely between hostels and targets young girls, sometimes older teenagers. After consulting with the profiler, Van Rooimbeke and the investigators compiled a list of 223 individuals who matched this profile. Many had alibis, and ultimately the list was narrowed down to 95 individuals. Soon, Van Rooimbeke proposed an idea that gave an incredible boost to the investigation. He requested the police to look into similar attack cases in youth hostels across all of France, not just in the region. Then they discovered a case dating back to 1994, 2 years before Caroline's murder. It occurred in La Croix-en-Touraine, where a group of Irish girls was staying in a hostel. One of the girls awoke at night to find a man sitting on her bed. He asked if she wanted to get up and help him fix his car. Shocked, she repeatedly asked who he was, but he did not respond. The girl turned on the light, after which he got up and left. The most striking part of this incident was that she saw him the next day at a picnic. He passed by and smiled at her. She reported the encounter to the hostel director, and the man was apprehended by the police. He did not deny being in the room, but claimed he had simply made a mistake and entered the wrong room. No charges were filed against him because he essentially hadn't done anything wrong. Gendarmes decided to keep watch over the hostel, and on the night of July 19, 1994, around 2:30 a.m., they arrested a man who was trying to enter the building. When interrogated, he stated that he had done nothing wrong, that he lived in London, worked as a waiter, and was simply looking for a place to spend the night. His car was registered in the Netherlands. It was searched, but nothing was found. After 8 hours, he had to be released. However, they recorded his name, Francisco Arce Montes. Francisco was a Spaniard, 47 years old at the time. His description largely matched the composite sketch of the suspect. Although he seemed to have no direct ties to the village of Plenfouger, he became a suspect due to his handwriting being similar to that of the killer. At the age of 20, Francisco first exhibited troubling behavior when he exposed himself to a neighbor. He was sent to a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with depression and progressing schizophrenia. Francisco occasionally worked as a waiter or driver, but mostly relied on financial support from his father. Surprisingly, his first assault led to a brief romance and the birth of his son. In 1981, he broke into the room of a French woman in a hostel in the Netherlands, where he sexually assaulted her without her consent. They later crossed paths in Paris, where they began a relationship and became parents. However, the woman soon left Francisco due to his aggressive behavior. In addition to this incident, he faced 4 charges of violence in Germany, 14 cases in Spain, and 1 more attempted assault in France prior to Caroline's murder. He had cards from various hostels worldwide because he always stayed in them while traveling. This painted a troubling picture for Judge Renaud van Rooimbeke, who feared that Francisco might be an international serial offender. The pressing question became how to locate him, given that he did not stay in one place or even one country for long. The judge contacted the police in Spain and asked them to visit the man's mother's house in Asturias. However, the woman stated that she hadn't seen her son in a long time. During their last meeting, the son took the money that his father had left him as an inheritance and never returned. Judge Renaud van Roombeke had achieved significant success in the investigation, but at that very moment, he was transferred to Paris, and his position was to be taken over by his colleague, Francis Doybin. On March 30th, 2001, Francis Doybin gave an interview to the British newspaper, The Sunday Times. The judge mentioned that investigators had narrowed the list of suspects down to 40 people, with the name Francisco Archimontes at the top of the list. In France, it would have been impossible to publish the name of a suspect who had not been formally charged or even interrogated. However, since this was the British press, that issue did not arise, and the journalist boldly printed the name. Then fate intervened in the investigation. Several copies of the Sunday Times were sent to Detroit. Although Americans typically do not read British newspapers, Tommy Onko, an employee of the U.S. Immigration Service, came across the newspaper and read the article about Caroline's case. He remembered reading about the case before and was surprised that it had not been solved yet. His professional curiosity prompted him to enter the name Francisco into the database, and he found it. Not only had Francisco crossed the U.S. border, but he had also been imprisoned in Miami for assaulting a girl from Ireland. He was awaiting trial. It turns out that Francisco, sticking to his habits, had stayed in a hostel in Miami. It was a very inexpensive place, mainly populated by tourists or students. Initially, he attempted to sneak into the room of two tourists from Chile while one girl was sunbathing by the pool and the other had returned to the room. When the second girl opened the door, she saw a man near her sleeping friend's bed. The stranger claimed he had the wrong room and quickly disappeared. The tourists were frightened but did not report it to the police. Meanwhile, 4 students from Ireland were also staying in the same hostel. They returned quite late at night and went to bed. In the morning, one girl discovered that a towel was lying on her intimate parts, but she distinctly remembered going to bed in a t-shirt and shorts after her shower. The girl reported that her underwear had been shifted, and she felt uncomfortable in her intimate area. Semen was found on the bed linens. Upon learning about the incident involving the students, the tourists from Chile also reported that a man had entered their room. The next day, the Chileans saw the man sneaking around them. He was casually walking by the pool. The girls contacted the police, and the man was taken to the station. It was only there that he finally agreed to give his name, Francisco Archimontes. During the interrogation, the man asked strange questions that confused the police. For example, he inquired whether it was considered a crime to enter someone else's room while drunk, and whether masturbation was a crime. Thanks to the intervention of U.S. Immigration Officer Tommy Onko, things moved very quickly. The Americans took his DNA and compared it with the DNA of Caroline's killer, and it matched. Francisco Arce Montes had assaulted and murdered Caroline Dickinson in Brittany 5 years earlier. His criminal record was phenomenal. He had committed assaults all over the world, in Spain, Germany, England, Chile, Mexico, the U.S., and France. He was an international serial offender. Naturally, he refused to be extradited. He wanted to be tried in the U.S. first for the attempted assault. However, he was handed over to France. Francisco's trial took place in 2004. The prosecution gathered all the testimonies to understand what happened on that day. On July 15th, Francisco visited a hostel in the village of Plenfuguer to scout the area, although he was already well acquainted with the layout of rooms in hostels. On the 17th, around midnight, he returned intending to commit a crime. He was seen by teacher Nicholas Ward and 3 girls heading to the restroom. Since there were too many potential witnesses awake in the building, Francisco left the premises and drove 50 kilometers to another hostel in the village of Saint-Lunaire. However, he was met with failure there as he was spooked. He then decided to return to Plenfuguer, hoping that everyone was asleep since it was already nearing 4 a.m. There is a possibility that Francisco spotted Caroline when she returned from the restroom, or that he randomly entered room number 4. The man did not deny assaulting Caroline, but claimed that he did not intend to strangle her. It was an unfortunate accident. He insisted that he was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions. Nevertheless, he was sentenced to the maximum penalty for his crime, 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. He appealed but lost. A few years later, in 2010, he requested to serve his sentence in Spain, but his request was denied. In 2015, he was also accused of assaulting a young woman that had occurred in 1997, a year after Caroline's murder. He was tried in Spain and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He must serve this sentence after his release from French prison, where he is to remain until January 2027. In 2018, he was sentenced to an additional 2 months in prison for assault. Clearly, Francisco Archimontes will not be released anytime soon. This case demonstrates how effective cooperation among several countries can be, even if they sometimes need a bit of luck. This brutal crime will be remembered thanks to the diligent work of investigators and the investigating judge, who were willing to undertake monumental and very difficult work, as well as the incredible chain of events that led to the arrest of the assailant and murderer. But above all, this was made possible thanks to the efforts of John Dickinson, Caroline's father, who never gave up and believed that one day the perpetrator would be caught. This is the story of Candice Hiltz, an extraordinarily gifted young woman whose potential was boundless, if only her life hadn't been cut short so tragically. Candice was born on December 22, 1988 in Cannon City, Colorado. Her mother was discharged from the hospital on Christmas morning, and when they arrived home, her parents wrapped baby Candice in a blanket and placed her under the Christmas tree as a surprise for her 5 older brothers and her sister. The older siblings adored their little sister, admired her incredible courage, and feared her razor-sharp sense of humor. Candice was straightforward, unafraid of anyone, and said exactly what was on her mind. She believed deeply in justice, seeing the world in black and white. If you were wrong, you were simply wrong. She was the same way in school, with a deep intolerance for bullies. So no one was surprised when she announced her plans to apply to Stanford University, become a prosecutor, and eventually take a seat on the Supreme Court. She would have undoubtedly succeeded because she was incredibly talented. Candice graduated from high school at 14. By 17, she had written a research paper to apply for a scholarship to Stanford Law School, and her test scores exceeded all expectations. She won the scholarship. Her mother, Dolores Hiltz, was immensely proud of her daughter. Unfortunately, Candice's father couldn't share in the joy. He had passed away a few years prior. However, Candice had to put her plans for Stanford on hold when she gave birth to her daughter. During her pregnancy, Candice suffered a stroke, which affected the developing baby. Her daughter, Paige, was born with hydranencephaly, an extremely rare congenital brain anomaly. Doctors gave Paige only a few days to live. Although she lived longer than expected, her condition remained life-threatening. So young mother Candice decided that Stanford could wait, but spending time with her daughter was her priority. Paige couldn't speak or walk, but she was happy thanks to her mother's love and dedication. They did everything together, took walks, played in the snow, and celebrated Paige's birthday every single week. As it turned out, Candice made the right decision, as she would not live to see her daughter's first true birthday. Soon, another member of the Hiltz family fell ill. Candice's older brother, James Hiltz, struggled deeply with their father's death. He turned to alcohol and illegal substances, and his personality began to change. After his wife left him with their children, James also left the house, eventually settling in the woods behind his mother's home. He suffered from severe clinical depression. The once joyful James could no longer hold a conversation and developed an overwhelming fear of people, even his own family. It was painful for his loved ones to see him in this state. All they could do for him was to leave food out, allowing him to pick it up when no one else was around. After the death of Dolores's husband and Candice's father, the family moved to the Copper Gulch area in Fremont County, Colorado. By the summer of 2006, Dolores was living there in a trailer with Candice and Paige. That summer marked the beginning of a series of events that, according to Dolores, triggered a chain reaction leading to her daughter's death. One day, while returning home from the store, mother and daughter turned onto their road in Copper Gulch and noticed 2 cars parked on the roadside. In one vehicle sat a police officer, in the other was a man known locally as a drug dealer. They saw the man approach the police car and hand the officer an envelope. Rumors had been circulating that one of the officers was abusing his power, so the women couldn't help but wonder what was in that envelope. It seemed like the officer might be accepting bribes. Candice, who had zero tolerance for dishonest cops, was furious, but the women decided there was nothing they could do since they had no proof. In early August 2006, the family encountered that same police officer again. His name was Trace Hall, and he knocked on their door. The officer was looking for James, Candice's older brother, whom the police suspected of breaking into cabins and stealing. Dolores told the officer that James didn't live with them, but had settled in the hills, away from people. She tried to explain that they had little contact with him, but the officer abruptly cut her off, accusing her of lying. At this point, Candice stepped in, outraged by his words, and began yelling at the officer. He threatened to arrest her if she didn't calm down. Candice held out her hands and said, "Go ahead, arrest me. I'll tell everyone how you take envelopes from drug dealers." The officer was visibly shocked. He spun around and briskly walked back to his car. That incident frightened Dolores, especially as strange things started happening afterward. A few days later, she came home and couldn't find Jackson, the family's dog. She was puzzled. Even when he went outside, he never left the yard. Since they lived near the edge of the forest, Dolores feared that a mountain lion might have taken him. She searched all the nearby hills and wandered through the woods until dark, but Jackson was nowhere to be found. Tuesday, August 15, 2006 arrived, and Candice was completely exhausted. Her young daughter, Paige, had a high fever all night. Dolores didn't want to leave her daughter and granddaughter alone, but she urgently needed to go into town to help a friend. Candice assured her she would lie down to rest, and ignoring her inner voice, Dolores left. While she was gone, Candice's boyfriend and Paige's father, Jesse Weaver, stopped by. As he approached the front door, he could hear Paige crying hysterically. Entering the house, he was met with a horrifying sight: a large pool of blood on the floor and splatters across the walls. Following the sound of Paige's cries, he found her in her crib in Candice's room. But Candice herself was nowhere to be found. Holding his daughter, Jesse rushed to the neighbors. Around 3:20 p.m., Dolores returned with Jesse's mother. Jesse asked if Candice was with them, and the question left them speechless. Dolores hurried into the house. The entryway was covered in blood, and the back door was open. She went to Candice's room, looked around, and then noticed the bed. It was slightly lifted and propped up as if someone had placed a speaker under it. A turquoise blanket was sticking out from beneath. Dolores pulled on the blanket and found Candice. The wound on her head was so horrific it was as if she'd been nearly decapitated. 1,000 thoughts rushed through Dolores's mind, from "I love you" to "Who did this?" She felt trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. It took the police nearly an hour to arrive at the crime scene. During that time, Dolores held her daughter's hand, refusing to let go. The detectives who arrived had never encountered such a brutal murder. The killer had shot Candice in the face, chest, and back of the head. What baffled them was why her body had been hidden under the bed. Typically, a victim isn't moved from the scene, especially since hiding her wouldn't have seriously delayed the investigation. The police couldn't understand why the killer would do this. Fortunately, Paige was completely unharmed. Detective Robert Dodd was assigned to the investigation. Throughout the entire investigation, he spoke with Dolores only twice, and each time briefly. He had little information for her and answered her questions evasively. However, he immediately ruled out Candice's boyfriend, Jesse Weaver, as a suspect. His alibi was verified. After examining the crime scene, the police concluded that Candice likely heard a noise behind the house and walked down the hallway toward the living room, where she encountered someone who shot her. Suspicion immediately fell on her older brother, James, as the two hadn't been on the best of terms recently. A search for James Hiltz began. Police knew he often slept outdoors, and locating him across such a vast area took several days. Heavily armed officers scoured the forest, even deploying a helicopter. During the search for Jimmy Hiltz, police made a horrifying discovery. They found Jackson, the Hiltz family dog, tied to a tree, already severely decomposed. His leash was still on him, as though he'd just been brought into the woods. Finally, after 3 grueling days of searching, the police located James Hiltz. James was arrested and searched, but no firearm was found on him. He immediately insisted he had nothing to do with what happened to his younger sister. Detectives attempted to question him, hoping to hear his side, but he was in no condition to speak. Psychiatrists deemed him incompetent. No DNA, no blood, or any trace of Candice was found on him. Dolores, who had already lost one child, feared losing another. She believed her son was being made a scapegoat, yet he was unable to defend himself. Every day, Dolores worried about whether her son might harm himself. Meanwhile, Dolores was allowed to return home, and she was horrified and outraged to see that the police had overlooked many pieces of evidence. The back door of the house had no crime scene tape, and items marked as evidence, such as the blood-stained blanket and a shell casing found in Paige's crib, were scattered about. The blanket that wrapped Candice remained in place. It became clear to Dolores that the police had not done a thorough job. The crime scene was not secured, allowing anyone to enter the house. Along with one of her sons, who was studying forensics, she collected evidence and tried to present it to the detectives at the station, but no one would listen to her. Finally, after some time, a detective came to her home, demanded the bags of evidence, and left. Dolores was furious with the police. In January 2007, she filed an official complaint, noting that the officers had poorly handled the crime scene. She also shared her theory that detectives from the Fremont County Sheriff's Office were involved in the murder of her 17-year-old daughter. In fact, she believed that 7 officers were implicated. As time went on, the police had no other suspects besides James. However, in the absence of evidence proving that James had killed his sister, he was only charged with burglary. Before the trial could begin, he was deemed incompetent and sent to a psychiatric facility for an indefinite period until his mental health improved. Immediately after that, the murder investigation stalled. The public wanted to know more about the case, but law enforcement provided no information, including the autopsy results. They didn't even disclose how many times Candice had been shot. The case was left unattended, as if everyone had forgotten about it, even though it remained open. 10 years passed. In 2016, street racer Rick Ratzliff, who had an interest in history and vintage items, decided to purchase a storage unit at an auction. Potential buyers were allowed to quickly inspect the contents of the unit. Rick noticed a police uniform and had emergency lights for a police car and became eager to buy it. Since there were no other bidders, he acquired the unit for $80. Inside, he found a police uniform with the name Robert Dodd on the shirt. He also discovered bags labeled evidence, containing items such as a rope, an axe, socks, and a blanket. Rick couldn't believe his luck. He sought advice from a police acquaintance, but didn't realize that the acquaintance would hastily relay their conversation to Robert Dodd. The detective and his wife contacted Rick via social media, offering to buy the storage unit from him. They spun tales about family heirlooms and photographs being left behind. Rick merely laughed and told them not to hope for that. Sheriff Jim Baker of the county also reached out to Rick, warning him that his life could now be in danger. Rick took this as a threat and reported it to the FBI. Ultimately, it was discovered that the items from the storage unit were linked to the unsolved murder case of Candice Hiltz. How could the evidence end up among a detective's personal belongings? And how could he forget to pay the rent, leading to the sale of the unit? Due to public pressure, in January 2017, Robert Dodd was suspended from his position, and the police launched an internal investigation. The detective resigned and moved to Texas. Thanks to the persistence of journalists, the autopsy results were made public, revealing a lot of new information about Candice's murder. She had been shot 7 times. A .410 shotgun was used to shoot her in the face, while a .45 caliber Colt revolver bullet was found in her chest. Additionally, 5 .22 caliber bullets had been fired into her head from behind. When it became known that 3 different types of bullets were found in her body, Dolores became convinced that her son James was not the killer. She believed that at least 2 people had shot her daughter simultaneously. Jackson, their dog, had been killed 5 days before Candice's death to facilitate the intruder's access to the house. Whenever anyone approached, Jackson would bark loudly. On August 15th, in the middle of the day, only Candice and Paige were at home. The killers likely did not know that Dolores had left and may have come in pairs or threes. Dolores speculated that Candice heard someone breaking into the house and ran to the living room. At that moment, one person shot her from the front, while another shot her from behind. A third individual could have used the third type of weapon. The killers then dragged the victim to the bedroom to hide her, and at that moment, Candice's body likely twitched, which can sometimes happen after death. This prompted them to shoot her again, and one of the spent casings ended up in Paige's crib. In her home, Dolores had also seen towels that the killers must have used to wipe themselves. These were later found discarded nearby, and DNA from the towels did not belong to any family member, which completely exonerated James. Furthermore, no weapons were found on James during his arrest, raising questions about how he could have obtained 3 different types of firearms. Additionally, James was terrified of interacting with other people, leading the family to believe he could not have conspired with anyone to kill his younger sister. The victim's loved ones were convinced that the police were hiding something. Clearly, there was a sinister undercurrent to the case that they had not yet suspected. In May 2017, Robert Dodd's troubles continued to mount. He called a junkyard to request the removal of trash from his home and its disposal. However, an employee became suspicious when he noticed that much of the waste resembled evidence. Among other items, there were several DVDs, a crime scene investigator's bag with the county abbreviation, a computer, and about 15 to 30 tapes labeled violence. Envelopes contained statements from victims of sexual assaults, many of which appeared to have been made by children, as they included drawings depicting what had happened to them. This discovery indicated that Detective Dodd not only stored evidence in a storage unit, but also took it home. While none of the items found were directly linked to Candice's murder, the situation looked extremely bad for the detective. In May 2017, Robert Dodd faced accusations of misconduct. An investigation into his actions began in June 2018. It was revealed that Dodd had stored numerous items collected during the investigation into Candice Hiltz's case in his personal storage unit. Most of the so-called evidence was found in the woods during the search for James Hiltz, and it was later determined that these were merely discarded items that did not pertain to the case. However, police cannot simply throw away such items. They must be cataloged and documented before disposal. Detective Dodd was too lazy to go through this process, so he left the items in his storage unit, intending to deal with them later, but ultimately forgetting about them. Once he learned that his unit had been sold at auction, he quickly made a list of the items, backdating it to 2007. Over the years, he altered his report on Candice's murder 6 times after realizing the sale of his storage unit could raise questions about his handling of the case. The court found him guilty of this misconduct. Initially, media reports suggested that a rope and an axe found among the evidence were bloodstained and that the axe was used to kill the family dog, Jackson. However, it turned out that Jackson had been shot and the axe was merely a decorative item that was not sharp. There was no blood on these items, meaning the significance of many items stored in the unit had been exaggerated. Still, it was possible that relevant evidence pointing to another suspect was present, but it had been improperly stored for 10 years, making DNA analysis impossible. Ultimately, Robert Dodd was not charged with any involvement in Candice's murder. In July 2019, he filed for a probationary sentence with a fine of $1,000. The Hiltz family considered this punishment a slap in the face. Following Dodd's case, 10 other police officers unrelated to the Hiltz investigation were also relieved of duty. The reputation of the Fremont County Sheriff's Office suffered greatly. There were suspicions that the motive behind Candice's murder was police corruption, possibly leading to efforts to silence her. Whether the officers acted on their own or were covering for someone else, the Hiltz family, particularly Dolores, remained convinced that the police were involved in her daughter's murder. What's intriguing is that Dolores initially shared the police's belief that her son James could have killed his younger sister. During her first conversation with the police, Dolores stated that the whole family feared James because he had become uncontrollably aggressive. This conversation was recorded on video, though she now claims she never said such things. James hadn't always been this way. Following their father's death, he struggled to cope, became addicted to substances and alcohol, and started working in a morgue in 2005. His ex-wife believed he may have become dependent on embalming fluid, which contains formaldehyde, ethanol, and methanol, offering a euphoric effect, but in larger doses, leading to aggression, paranoia, and symptoms resembling schizophrenia. His ex-wife also could not reconcile the family's assurances that James wouldn't harm a fly, recalling an incident when he violently pushed her, causing her to injure her face. Fearing his erratic behavior, she left him on July 12th, just a month before Candice's murder. Around the same time, James also left home, living in the woods. However, he wasn't as reclusive as Dolores portrayed. He had been involved in multiple confrontations, including a significant fight with one of his brothers, Nick, where he choked Nick and threw him against a wall. Candice intervened, hitting James with a frying pan to release her brother's grip, while their dog, Jackson, bit James in defense of Candice. After this altercation, Jackson disappeared, and the family initially believed James was involved. Candice accused him of doing something to Jackson, which enraged James. Dolores later recounted to the police that she had never seen her son so furious. The morning before Candice's murder, Jesse Weaver, Candice's boyfriend, also had a confrontation with James. After Jesse visited another brother of Candice's and was told he wasn't home, James grabbed Jesse and attempted to stab him. Fortunately, Jesse managed to escape. These accounts illustrate James's aggression and indicate he did not entirely shy away from social interactions, contrary to Dolores's claims. Regarding the theory that there were at least 2 killers, the use of 3 types of ammunition doesn't necessarily imply 3 different firearms. A ballistics expert explained that a .410 shotgun can fire various types of shells. The autopsy indicated the first shot was fired from 5 meters away, precisely the distance from the front door to the hallway where Candice fell. This means the perpetrator could have initially shot her with the .410 shotgun, and then, as she fell, reloaded and fired a round into her chest up close. If the body made a post-mortem sound or movement while being wrapped in a blanket, it could explain the subsequent 5 shots to the head with .22 caliber ammunition. As for Jackson, early reports claimed he was decapitated with an axe or hatchet, but he had actually been shot 3 times with a .22 caliber weapon, with the police recovering these bullets as evidence. A forensic expert believed the bullets found in both Jackson and Candice were fired from the same firearm. James had the opportunity to acquire both types of firearms and ammunition. He had been breaking into local cabins, stealing food and other items, and evidence found at these crime scenes linked James Hiltz to the burglaries. Firearms similar to those used in Candice's and Jackson's murders had been reported stolen from these cabins before their deaths. A .410 shotgun was later found in the woods, indicating someone had attempted to break it with an axe. Alongside it, officers discovered a flashlight, a bloodied shirt, and a bloodied towel containing a piece of skull, confirmed to be Candice's. This suggests that after killing Candice, the perpetrator fled through the woods. Further supporting the theory that James could be the murderer is the observation that if corrupt police officers had killed Candice, they likely wouldn't have gone through the effort of dragging her body into the bedroom, propping the bed with a computer speaker, and hiding her beneath it. Officers with experience at crime scenes would know such actions would not effectively conceal the murder. This awkward attempt to hide the body suggests panic or guilt on the part of the perpetrator. Conversely, this could indicate someone had set James up, as no blood or DNA belonging to Candice was found on him, nor were there any fingerprints on the weapon. The bloodied towels Dolores discovered were clearly used by the killer or killers, and DNA on them didn't match James. Despite the circumstantial evidence, James was never charged with his sister's murder. He remains a patient in a treatment facility where he has taken on a role as a consultant, helping others. Another theory regarding Candice's murder suggests that an unknown intruder attacked her, making it a random killing. However, it seems implausible that a stranger could enter a home armed to the teeth, kill a girl, hide her body in her room, and leave without assaulting her or stealing anything. This complicated case remains officially open, but no progress has been reported. No one could have anticipated that the terminally ill Paige would outlive her mother. After Candice's death, Dolores took on the responsibility of caring for her granddaughter. Paige passed away in 2015 at the age of 7. Her family believes she is now in heaven, free to do all the things she couldn't do on Earth, running, playing, and building snowmen with her mother, always under the watchful protection of loyal Jackson. In the late 1980s, the French town of Annemasse in Haute-Savoie was gripped by fear. Girls and young women were becoming targets of a dangerous criminal, attacked on the street, in elevators, or on stairwells. There was no safe haven, not even under the roof of their own homes. He would suddenly ambush his victims, bind them, gag them, and subject them to violence. Not all would survive encounters with the maniac. This investigation would yield many clues before the killer, with his particularly disturbing modus operandi, was unmasked. The press dubbed him the Monster of Annemasse, as if the perpetrator of these atrocities were not human. But the true horror lies in the fact that he was human, a fellow resident of Annemasse just like his young victims. This story began in March 1986 in the town of Annemasse, located in Haute-Savoie, near the Swiss border. On March 13th at 5:15 p.m., 13-year-old Guillaume Bouvier returned home from school. He wasn't alone, he was with his friend, Jerome. The boys approached the apartment door, and Guillaume was about to turn the handle and enter, as he usually did. But to his surprise, the door was locked. He was puzzled, as his younger sister Sophie was always the first to come home from school. 10-year-old Sophie Bouvier was a very well-behaved girl, but she often ignored their mother's request to lock the door. Of course, Guillaume had his own set of keys somewhere at the bottom of his school bag. He searched for them, found them, and unlocked the door. Letting Jerome in and stepping inside, Guillaume noticed a letter opener on the hallway table, one he had never seen before. He heard the sound of running water coming from his mother's room, and a few drops of water had somehow made their way into the hallway. Apart from this, the apartment was unusually quiet. As Guillaume wondered what it all could mean, the door to his mother's room suddenly opened, and a stranger stepped out. The man appeared completely calm and relaxed. He looked very young, and Guillaume thought he might be the older brother of one of Sophie's friends. In other words, the confused boy was trying to make sense of the stranger's presence in his home. Meanwhile, the man casually asked if Guillaume knew where his sister Sophie was. Guillaume, bewildered, shook his head. At that moment, the phone rang. Guillaume knew it was his mother calling. She phoned at the same time every day to make sure both of her children had made it home safely from school and that everything was okay. Guillaume approached the phone to answer it. It really was their mother. She asked if Sophie had come home, because when she called earlier, her daughter hadn't answered. Guillaume replied, "No, Mom, Sophie isn't here," and then asked who the man was that he had just encountered in their apartment. By then, the man had opened the door and left just as Guillaume picked up the phone. His mother didn't understand what man he was talking about and asked her son to check again if Sophie was really not home. Guillaume and Jerome began searching the rather spacious apartment together. Guillaume opened the bathroom door and was paralyzed with horror. His little sister, young Sophie, was there. She was lying in the bathtub, submerged in water, completely naked. Her ankles and wrists were bound, tape was wrapped over her eyes, and a gag was stuffed in her mouth. Guillaume rushed to call for emergency services, while Jerome carefully pulled the girl out of the water. He removed the gag from her mouth and attempted to administer first aid. Soon, emergency responders arrived and quickly took Sophie to the hospital. It was standard procedure, but they already knew that Sophie had died, and there was nothing they could do to save her. The police who arrived at the scene discovered that young Sophie Bouvier lived in a fairly upscale neighborhood with her mother and older brother. Her parents were both doctors. Her father had passed away just a year before Sophie's murder, and her mother, Michelle Bouvier, worked as a factory physician. Michelle was an exceptionally attentive and caring mother. Sophie attended school and spent her free time practicing dance. The school was only 300 meters away from her home, so all she had to do was cross the square to get back. Sophie would always come home at the same time each day. However, she had a habit of forgetting to lock the door, so her mother had attached a note to the door that read, "Sophie, be careful. Lock the door when you are alone in the apartment." Every day at the same time, her mother would call to make sure Sophie had returned home safely. This time, when Sophie didn't answer, her mother grew very worried. In the apartment, the police found the items the perpetrator had used: a gag, ropes, and adhesive tape. The gag was a pair of underwear cut in half and wrapped with adhesive tape to ensure it stayed securely in her mouth. The autopsy revealed that the killer had drowned Sophie in the bathtub. There were no signs of violent assault, but the perpetrator had touched her in intimate areas. The police found traces of male semen on a towel, indicating that the assailant had gratified himself without directly assaulting the girl. However, in 1986, semen evidence could not aid the investigation, as DNA analysis was not yet available. Sophie's older brother Guillaume and his friend Jerome were questioned about the stranger they had seen in the apartment. The boys described a tall and very thin young man, wearing glasses with thick frames and dressed in plain brown clothing, more suited for an elderly person. The boys helped the police create a composite sketch of the suspect. The murder of the 10-year-old girl undoubtedly sent shockwaves through the city. The police were under immense pressure, but the investigation proved difficult as the killer had left very few clues. There was only a partial fingerprint, which was insufficient for any substantial use, and traces of semen found on the towel. The only witnesses, young Guillaume and Jerome, were traumatized and had only seen the murderer for a few seconds, so they couldn't provide a detailed description. However, the investigators weren't entirely at a dead end, because this crime reminded them of another similar case. The detectives remembered an attack that had occurred just 8 months prior, in June of the previous year, and in the same neighborhood. On June 21, 1985, 8-year-old Angelique was heading home for lunch. She entered the elevator of her building, followed by a man who pressed the button for the basement. Without wasting any time, the man attacked her, dragged her into the basement, tied her hands behind her back, sealed her mouth with adhesive tape, placed a noose around her neck, and began cutting her clothes with scissors. He then removed the tape from Angelique's mouth and ordered her to satisfy him. However, he did not kill his victim. He left Angelique sitting on a garbage bin with a bag over her head and fled the scene. But the nightmare was far from over for the young girl. In tears, she made her way back to the elevator where the man had attacked her. When she entered the elevator, the rope around her neck got caught in the door. Thankfully, the elevator's safety mechanism was triggered and it stopped. Had the elevator moved slightly higher, the rope would have strangled Angelique. She was found in the elevator, crying and screaming, but alive. Unfortunately, she was too traumatized to help create a composite sketch of the attacker, and the investigation into Angelique's assault remained stalled for 8 months. The assault on Angelique and the murder of Sophie bore several similarities, particularly in the way the attacker had cut the victim's clothing. A week after Sophie's murder, her mother contacted the police, reporting that she had found the clothes Sophie was wearing on the day of her death. The clothing had been hidden in a closet and was cut into pieces. Investigators had to acknowledge that a dangerous predator was at large, a rapist and killer who followed a ritualistic pattern, revealing a deeply unsettling personality. Continuing their investigation, the detectives found a third similar case that had occurred 3 months earlier. On December 14, 1985, 12-year-old Stephanie returned home from school. She entered the elevator, and a young man followed her in, pressing the button for the basement. When he attacked her, Stephanie screamed. The man threatened, "If you scream, I'll kill you, but if you stay quiet, I won't do anything." Of course, the girl didn't believe him. Stephanie kept screaming. The man dragged her into the basement, where to her horror she saw a mattress laid out on the floor. The stranger placed her on the mattress, shoved a cloth into her mouth, which turned out to be a piece of his underwear, taped her eyes shut, and tied her up. He threatened her with a piece of glass he found nearby and began touching her intimate areas. Stephanie didn't stop fighting. Then the man started to strangle her, simultaneously blocking her nostrils. The girl panicked. She couldn't breathe anymore and realized he was going to kill her. She decided to act as if she were dead to make her attacker leave her alone. The trick worked. The man fled, and Stephanie survived. The girl described the same man to the police that Guillaume and Jerome had seen. The criminal was young, but looked like an old man because of his clothing. He had clearly prepared for the attack, as he had laid out the mattress and left pieces of tape stuck to the walls, which were meant to aid him in his sinister task. Sophie and Angelique's homes were 100 meters apart. Stephanie lived less than a kilometer away from the girls. So before Sophie's murder, 2 attacks on girls had taken place in the same area over the span of a few months. Why then did Sophie's mother allow her to return home alone? Because she had no idea about the other elevator attacks. These incidents hadn't been reported due to the upcoming elections, so the media didn't raise the alarm. But after Sophie's murder, it became impossible to conceal that a dangerous criminal had appeared in the city, attacking children in their own homes. The man himself resembled a teenager, though he wore strange clothing. It was then that the press coined the nickname the Enmus Monster for him. Needless to say, all the parents were in a panic. No child was allowed to return home alone anymore. Police officers stood guard at the entrances to schools. Meanwhile, the police combined the 3 attacks into one case. However, aside from the description of the man, they still had nothing to go on. The letter opener led nowhere, as it was the most common model. As for the underwear the criminal used as a gag, the police went to stores that sold similar items and showed them a composite sketch. But it was all in vain. The police decided to share their only lead, the composite sketch, with the public. They sent the sketch to the media in the hope that someone would recognize the criminal. However, it was almost like hoping for a miracle, because the man in the composite sketch had no distinguishing features. He looked like any ordinary young man, resembling an office worker. It was no surprise that when the image of the killer appeared in the press, the police were overwhelmed with a flood of phone calls. Everyone in the city believed that their neighbor was the murderer. Hundreds of calls, each one needing to be investigated. They took up a lot of officers' time. A month after Sophie's murder, a report came in about a truly suspicious man. He was seen standing near a school, not just any school, but the one Sophie had attended. The suspicious man had been noticed by the parents of students. The police set up an ambush, and the man soon appeared. During the arrest, he trembled like a leaf and began crying. He was taken to the station for identification. Sophie's brother Guillaume and his friend Jerome immediately pointed to the suspect. However, the man had an alibi for the day of the murder. He was a bank employee and had been at work on March 13th at 5:15 p.m., as confirmed by his boss. So what had he been doing near the school? The man confessed that he wasn't interested in little girls, but rather a young, attractive woman who drove her son to school. He had been gathering the courage to talk to her for several days. Thus, it was yet another false lead. But still, Guillaume and Jerome had both identified the man. After the boys made the mistake, the police decided to protect them from frequent lineups to avoid compromising their testimonies. However, fate intervened when the teenager unexpectedly encountered the killer himself. On February 11th, 1987, 14-year-old Guillaume was walking through the center of Annemasse when he suddenly noticed a man he had seen at his house on that fateful day. He was as shocked as he had been during their first encounter, but there was no doubt in his mind that this was his sister's killer. The man also noticed the boy and quickly entered a nearby store. Guillaume followed him into the store, moving between the aisles. The man went outside, looked around, saw the boy still following him, crossed the street, quickened his pace, and entered a bar. Guillaume hid behind a car and waited. The man did not leave the bar. The boy really could have used a mobile phone, but at that time they simply didn't exist, so Guillaume ran to the nearest phone booth and called the police. The police arrived very quickly and cordoned off the bar, but the man was already gone. While the boy was calling the police, he had slipped away. No one had ever doubted that the killer and rapist was a local resident. Now that assumption was confirmed. Sophie's mother found it hard to push away the thought that the killer was living his life freely. On a sunny day, she thought he was probably sitting on the terrace of a cafe, drinking coffee, while her daughter Sophie lay in a cold grave. Nevertheless, Sophie's mother and brother continued to live in the same apartment. At first, her mother had wanted to move, but then she realized that it was their home, the place where they had been happy as a family, where Sophie had been happy. On the other hand, thanks to Guillaume's accidental encounter with the suspect, the police were able to improve and update the composite sketch of the suspect. Now the man was depicted wearing round metal frame glasses and had grown a mustache. The updated sketch was once again published in the media in the hope that someone would recognize the changes in the appearance of someone they knew. Indeed, the police were once again flooded with calls. Officers followed up on each lead, but once again, they received no results. 2 more years passed. On a cold January day in 1989, 15-year-old Sylvie came home from school. She took out her keys in front of her apartment door, unlocked it, and was about to enter as usual when someone suddenly attacked her from behind and shoved her into the apartment. The girl immediately screamed. The stranger tried to choke her with one hand, but she managed to break free and screamed again. In the hallway of the apartment, there was a low table with a vase on it. While Sylvie struggled with the attacker, the vase crashed to the floor. This startled the man, and he ran away. The police immediately interviewed the girl, and here's what she described. The attacker had covered his face with a stocking, so she couldn't identify him, but he was tall, thin, and wearing gloves. He hadn't had the chance to tie her up with ropes or cover her eyes with tape, but he was holding a small bottle with a clear liquid that resembled water. The police speculated that it was chloroform, which meant the suspect they were looking for was evolving and seeking new ways to quickly and effectively incapacitate his victims. They were convinced that the man who attacked Sylvie was the Amos monster. Yes, Sylvie was a little older than his previous victims, and he didn't have ropes or tape, but there were many other similarities. His build, the way he attacked, and the gloves. After all, at Sophie's crime scene, forensic experts hadn't found any fingerprints either. 6 months later, another attack occurred. On August 20th, 1990, 21-year-old Natalie was returning from a party at 1:30 in the morning. She had gotten a bit lost and was walking along a bridge leading to the highway when a man suddenly attacked her from behind. He dragged her under the bridge, tied her up, undressed her, and was about to assault her when Natalie, who had some developmental disabilities, unexpectedly consented. However, the man had planned to commit violence, not engage in consensual sex, and, shocked and confused by this turn of events, he abandoned the bound, naked girl and ran away. Natalie was found wearing only her bra with her clothes cut to pieces. At the station, Natalie told the police that the man had a stocking on his head, so she couldn't see his face. But she remembered that he had a backpack and a small glass bottle. He poured liquid from the bottle onto a piece of cloth, then held it to her face, causing her consciousness to become foggy. This confirmed the hypothesis of chloroform use. The police observed a clear evolution in the killer's modus operandi. He was no longer the one who prowled apartments and basements. Now he was moving around the city center with a backpack containing ropes, tape, and chloroform. The police decided to act on this new information. They started stopping all men aged 25 to 30 moving through the city with a backpack. This wasn't an entirely unrealistic task, because according to the 1990 census, Annemasse had a population of 27,500. Their persistence paid off. One deep March night in 1991, officers were called to a burglary scene. While working at the crime site, they accidentally noticed a man with a backpack who tried to flee when they arrived. The man was quickly caught and thrown to the ground. He was wearing a woman's stocking around his neck, wrapped as if it were a scarf, which appeared suspicious. They searched his backpack, and inside they found ropes, duct tape, and chloroform. The man was taken to the station, where investigators discovered his name, Lucien Gilles de Valliere. He was 24 years old. The investigators asked him what he was doing out so late with all these items in his backpack. The man claimed that he had been attacked some time ago and was looking for his attackers. However, he couldn't explain why he thought he would find them in that particular area at that hour, nor why he had run from the police when they arrived. At that moment, the investigator realized that the man sitting before him resembled the suspect they had been searching for over the past 6 years. However, the young man had no prior police record. The police decided to search his home, where he lived with his mother. On his desk, they found a camera. The window was covered with thick paper with a small round hole in it, perfect for a camera lens. They also found 2 large folders, neatly containing 4,200 photographs of girls, young women, and women. Lucien Gilles de Valliere had been photographing women walking down the street, exiting stores, and getting into cars. He had categorized them by hair color, brunettes, blondes, and brunettes, and had rated them. Some photos included addresses and phone numbers. Additionally, officers discovered adult magazines and clippings from newspapers about the Anmas monster. The officers had no doubt. They had found the Anmas monster, but the police had little evidence. The composite sketch had been circulating for 6 years, and all the photographs and notes would be of little use in court. So the investigator decided to bluff. He told the suspect that, with all the materials they had found, they had a serious case against him, and the young man confessed. Later, he explained that he thought they would beat him, which is why he confessed. In any case, it turned out that he remembered every attack in the finest detail, recalling each one almost minute by minute. But that wasn't all. He also confessed to other attacks that the police didn't know about. He had assaulted 3 girls in Geneva and 3 more in the outskirts of Anmas. With the exception of one incident where his victim was a 15-year-old girl, he typically targeted older girls. The attacks took place in parking lots or simply on the street, so he didn't always have time to pull out ropes or tape. This is probably why these incidents hadn't initially been connected to him. Most of these were unsuccessful attacks for him because the girls fought back and screamed, forcing him to flee quickly. Once he came close to being caught. In January 1991, he targeted a new victim. He had seen her close the blinds in her house and hastily concluded that she lived alone. The rapist broke into the house and attacked the girl in the bathroom. She screamed and her boyfriend rushed to help. The man chased the attacker, but during the pursuit, he tripped, fell, and injured his arm so badly that he could no longer work as a mechanic. Lucien Gilles Devalier managed to escape and continued planning his future attacks. It turned out that the guy killed Sophie when he was only 18 years old. How did he come to commit murder at such a young age? There were many events in his life that could explain this. Of course, not justify, but only explain. His mother adored him, doted on him, and spoiled him. His father, a brilliant mathematics teacher on the other hand, was quite strict and unemotional. The family relationship wasn't the warmest, but overall, he had a happy childhood. That is, until a man in his 50s lured him into a basement when he was 9 years old. He forced the boy to give him pleasure. The boy was in shock after what happened, and he found it difficult to tell his parents. So he wrote everything down in a letter. But his parents did nothing, fearing scandal. They told him not to talk to anyone about it. When the boy's parents did not go to the police, it was as if they were telling him, "You can survive such a horrifying event and the law will not intervene." The parents acted as if nothing had happened. The result was inevitable. The boy brushed his teeth 10 times a day, as if trying to wash away the dirt of what had happened. From a very young age, he developed a passion for sadomasochism. He would tie himself up, put a gag in his mouth, and inflict pain on himself. By the age of 12, he began dressing as a girl. At first, only at home, but by the age of 16, he would go out in public dressed that way. Later, he admitted how much he wanted someone to attack him. By then, his parents had divorced, and he lived with his mother. When his mother found his women's clothing, she did not attempt to understand what was happening with her son, but simply threw them away. At that moment, Lucien Gilles Devalier transformed from a victim into a predator. He no longer saw women as individuals, but as objects, wanting them to submit to his desires. He said that he had been in love with a girl during his teenage years and saw in Sophie's smile the smile of that girl he had loved, except that Sophie was only 10 years old. Before attacking her, he scoped out the area. He rode the elevator with her a few times, even learned her name through a brief exchange of polite words. A few days later, he returned and hid in a storage room, waiting for Sophie to come home. Once inside the apartment, he gagged her and stripped her naked. Sophie was undoubtedly terrified, clutching her teddy bear as if it could protect her. It's difficult to imagine what she felt when she heard the phone ring. She knew it was her mother calling and probably thought her mom would come to her rescue. Meanwhile, the attacker led Sophie to the bathroom, as it was part of his fantasy. He was aroused by the wet bodies of young girls. After satisfying his lust, he held Sophie underwater with his foot until she stopped moving. A few days after killing Sophie, he wrote in his diary, "It wasn't so bad." While he continued to commit crimes that grew more horrific, he seemed perfectly integrated into society. Lucien Gilles Devalier was an excellent student, loved roller skating, was interested in computers, and dated girls. 3 months after he killed Sophie, holding her underwater with his foot, he successfully enrolled in an undergraduate program. At the time of his arrest, he was studying chemistry at the University of Geneva. The young man seemed to suffer from a split personality, though psychiatrists disputed this. He was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists and a psychologist who concluded that he was exceptionally intelligent, experienced no hallucinations, delusions, or schizophrenia, and was fully aware of his actions. This meant he was fit to stand trial. Thus, he was initially tried for acts of violence and sentenced to 7 years. On December 6, 1993, he appeared in court for the murder of Sophie, the attempted murder of Stephanie, and the assault of Natalie, who suffers from developmental disabilities, which served as an aggravating factor. When he took the stand, according to his lawyer's recollections, he looked like a movie star, a horror movie star, 6 feet tall, weighing around 130 pounds with a childlike face. When he spoke, he did so entirely without emotion. He explained that he hadn't intended to kill Sophie, but when he saw the water in the bathtub, he felt an impulse he couldn't resist. He told the murdered girl's mother that he felt disgusted with himself, and if his death could bring her daughter back, he would give his life immediately and without hesitation. He claimed he'd used warm water when he filled the tub for Sophie, as if that made any difference. Lucien Gilles Devalier felt no remorse. Unlike many defendants, he didn't put on a show. He remained cold, detached, and rather self-centered. For example, when the investigator wanted to reenact the crime, the young man refused to go. The police insisted. Then he stated, "What you're doing is inhumane, bringing me to that place." A psychiatrist who took the stand testified that the young man was extremely dangerous because he used his sharp mind and meticulousness in service of his impulses to rape and kill. He experienced some difficulties in sexual matters, which drove him to seek new forms of gratification. At that time, psychiatry had no treatment to offer him. Experts unanimously affirmed that he was beyond rehabilitation. According to his lawyer, there should have been 4 people in the defendant's place: Lucien Gilles Devalier himself, the 50-year-old man who had assaulted him, and his parents. After all, his mother saw all the evidence in her son's room, but never did or said anything. Doesn't she bear some responsibility for his actions? Despite all of the lawyer's efforts, the court did not take any mitigating circumstances into account. The 26-year-old man was found guilty of the assault and murder of Sophie, as well as attacks on 2 other girls. He was sentenced to the maximum punishment, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. However, he appealed this decision, eventually securing eligibility for parole after 22 years. Despite numerous attempts to gain release, he is still serving his sentence in prison. After all, he's relatively young and could easily ruin more lives if released. But if he couldn't secure his freedom, he aimed to have his case forgotten. The convicted man decided to take action and, in 2019, filed a request with Google to delist news articles about his case. His request was denied.